In this news roundup of the week, the standoff with Russia over Ukraine continues, but division opens up between Ukraine and the US. The BBC invites the unvaccinated to join the audience at question time, and all hell breaks loose, and botched EU rules on agriculture are having all sorts of unintended consequences. My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. Is the focus for President Biden in the current crisis that of defending Ukraine, or instead of defending NATO and the alliance? As the standoff over Ukraine continues, it seems to be more the latter, and that's leading to some interesting difficulties. So it was reported by CNN that a phone call between Biden and the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky did not go well. They disagreed about the likelihood of and/or imminence of a Russian invasion attack. Biden and several other Western players have been talking this up to near certainty, probably in February once the ground has frozen. Zelensky, however, says that their perception is that the threat from Russia is dangerous but ambiguous, and is by no means convinced that an attack will actually take place. The account of a phone call reportedly came from a Ukrainian official, but the White House says that it wasn't an accurate description of the call and that anonymous sources were leaking falsehoods, which is a possibility in this situation. But that said, the difference in perspective seems to be in line with the apparent objectives of both sides and the recent history between them. A propagandist approach by the US to talking up the danger and the imminence of the threat could easily be seen as an attempt to bring more unity and urgency to the NATO alliance countries, particularly some of those like Germany that are economically dependent on Russia to a higher degree and therefore conflicted in how they respond. And in whipping together a united front, they seek to persuade Putin that the cost of proceeding would be too high, and that the divisions in the alliance that he hoped to exploit have ended and NATO has closed ranks against him. He, after all, Biden that is, owned up in last week's press conference to the worry that a minor incursion would see NATO countries divided in how to respond, which was arguably not a smart thing to do. But the strong line is seen as doing a lot more to pull robust-sounding commitments from Germany about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and from the EU about the potential removal of Russia from the SWIFT international financial system. Having been criticised for the lack of consultation in the Afghanistan withdrawal, Biden has been going the extra mile in including European leaders, holding a video call this week and adding new seats around his war council, adding Poland, Italy and the European Union to the existing big three of Britain, France and Germany. And European officials have been reportedly impressed with the higher levels of access and discussion they're now getting compared to the low point last year. They're still aware that Biden is weak at home and still regard him as a transitional president, but they say that there is a much greater sense of American leadership now in this crisis. On the other hand, Zelensky has an interest in playing down, not playing up, the degree of risk. He doesn't benefit if his own people begin to panic in the expectation of an invasion and start to react accordingly. So therefore he has been at pains to reassure his people that they should take a deep breath and to stay calm. The Kyiv government was caught out this week by the announcements by the US and the UK that they would reduce staff levels at the embassies in Ukraine, implying a solidifying belief in imminent threat. And maybe they have good reason for such a belief. One might alternatively speculate, though, that the trauma of being caught flat-footed in Afghanistan so recently has made them rather jumpy here. Whether he's waiting for frozen ground or he's waiting to see how long these fragile attempts to hold the line will last as the weeks pass and nothing happens, Putin arguably has no incentive to hurry right now. The chances of an opening coming along that can be exploited in one way or another in his pushback against what he sees as NATO expansionism, they have to be pretty high. That said, some commentators argue that Putin has overplayed his hand and is now caught in a trap of his own making. In my previous video on the conflict, I mentioned the views of some Putin watchers that it simply isn't his style to dive into a full-on frontal military assault, and they doubted this was ever his intention. They argue that the troop build-up in November was an attempt to force the West to back off from Ukraine, to relinquish any idea that it might be allowed to join NATO or even the EU in the future. But in calling his bluff and refusing to do any such thing, it's left Putin caught between actual armed conflict, which would be very costly and probably quickly unpopular at home, even if it was popular at first, or to retreat, which would be a huge humiliation probably. How do they think that Putin, famously shrewd as he is, got suckered into such a mistake? Well, they argue that the West's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan suggested that America was in full retreat from any position of leadership on the geopolitical stage, and with America obsessed with its domestic affairs and European states divided and increasingly economically dependent on Russian energy, it seemed like the perfect time to make a decisive push for a reshaping of the post-Cold War order. But unity comes from having an enemy, and it seems that he represented enough of one to achieve at least a degree of unity. If this is true, the question is, being caught in this trap, what is the least cost exit that Putin could take? Thomas DiNanno, former State Department arms control official in the Trump administration, said that the aggressive language calculated to bring Europe into unity might also end up pushing Putin into choosing the active conflict option. And he suggested it might be wise to begin to cool the language down and create an option to de-escalate. But then if you do that, do you lose the unity and suddenly make it look like there is an opportunity to divide the West? Whichever version of Putin is closest to reality, calculating and in control or caught in a trap, the incentives seem to line up for a long game from Russia. So don't expect this to resolve quickly. One can probably say the same about Boris Johnson's position as Prime Minister, which has dragged on without real progress this week, and one can also say the same about the end of the COVID pandemic, which has been seeing mixed movement across various countries. We will come to the latter of those two in just a minute, but first, we hear a lot right now from politicians and others, heck, even from YouTubers including me, about how we need to learn to live with COVID-19. But what does that actually mean, to learn to live with COVID? One expert was quoted as saying that a whole bunch of people clearly wanted it to mean that we just didn't have to do anything at all about it. Now, I wouldn't have put it quite like that, but I recognise myself in the wishful thinking that drives that version. We're all fed up of it. On the other hand, there are other people who seem to think that learning to live with COVID means, wearing masks forever, which I think is unlikely and an undesirable outcome. But maybe I'm wrong. So stepping away from the exhaustion of all this nonsense, stepping away from that wishful thinking, what do we know about what it will mean to live with COVID? What does it mean for a disease to become endemic? And what can we learn from similar diseases that became endemic in the past? That's what I'll be focusing on for the next deep dive video going live on this channel, 7 PM UK time on Monday next week. Join me for that. The COVID confusion over Omicron continues, with countries relaxing and even ending restrictions while others tighten up. All no doubt saying that they're following the science, which is as good an illustration as any of how vapid that phrase has become. Close to home for this channel, England's so-called Plan B restrictions came to an end this week, meaning an end to most restrictions. Face coverings no longer required at any venues, although some, such as a number of supermarkets and public transport, are going to continue to request customers to wear them. Guidance that workers should work from home where possible, gone. Any requirement for and use of vaccine passports, gone. Advice on face masks in schools, gone. You still have to self-isolate for at least 5 days if you get a positive COVID test, and there's still some testing requirements for international travel. But Boris Johnson said that he hoped not to have to renew self-isolation rules when they expire on March the 24th. Not so the Scottish Nationalist Party. The Scottish Government has published a bill this week that would make some of its emergency powers permanent. The Coronavirus Recovery and Reform Scotland Bill would give ministers the powers to respond to public health emergencies in a similar way to legislation passed in response to COVID-19. So that includes powers to impose lockdown restrictions, allow court hearings to take place remotely, and restrict access to schools. And to do these things without further recourse to Parliament. Unsurprisingly, the opposition parties were largely united in dismissing this as a power grab by the SNP. Mind you, it's not as though the situation in England is entirely consistent even now. At the same time as relaxing the rules, the government is still currently committed to sacking frontline NHS staff if they don't get vaccinated by next week. Currently, the NHS, enduring the usual winter strains on the service, has 80,000 such frontline unvaccinated staff. They've been told that they must be fully vaccinated by the 1st of April, which means a first jab by the 3rd of February to continue in those roles. At the end of the day, the NHS can stipulate on what basis it's prepared to employ people in certain roles, but the timing of the move and the likely self-inflicted harm it's going to do to a vulnerable service kind of makes it a bit of a puzzle. Still, even if they do get fired, at least the unvaccinated can join the audience at BBC's Question Time, because that 3rd of February deadline will also be when an episode dedicated to the issue is going to air, and the host, Fiona Bruce, has invited people who are unvaccinated to join the audience, where they may get the opportunity to talk about why they made that choice. If you are someone who has made that decision not to be vaccinated, we'd very much like to hear from you, she said. I think it's an important debate, which is refreshingly grown up of the BBC. Let's give it credit where it's due. Talking to people about why they've made important choices, it could catch on. Assuming they survive the backlash, of course. Demanding to know why people promoting misinformation should be given a platform, such as Sam Bright of the Byline Times. Putting anti-vaxxers on a debate programme implicitly suggests they have a legitimate point of view, even if everyone else disagrees with them. You have a massive duty to properly frame the boundaries of acceptable public debate, and you're still massively failing. Sam, it seems, has decided that these people he's never met, unvaccinated, not necessarily anti-vaxxer campaigners, maybe indeed including some of those NHS workers, some of the minority communities in London also that have low vaccination rates, they have nothing to say worth hearing, so you shouldn't be allowed to hear them. Well, he may be right about the first part, but if we don't get to hear them in their own words, how do we know? Another asked what risk assessment would be given to those in the audience who had been vaccinated, which is ridiculous on its face, a real symptom of why such a discussion is actually needed, and an illustration for some that this isn't about a disease anymore, it's more like a moral contagion. Surely, the point of getting vaccinated is you don't have to worry about who's sitting next to you. It's not a club of the clean to be kept safe from the unclean. But anyway, that's Twitter, not to be confused with real life. Hopefully those voices are as unrepresentative as Piers Corbyn on the other side. If you're in France, though, and you're unvaccinated, you'll find those attitudes are much more in control. Up until now, you needed a COVID-19 pass to go to restaurants, movie theatres and all the sort of places that the French like to go. But you could still get in if you could show a recent negative test or proof of recent recovery. Now, the unvaccinated will find themselves as welcome in restaurants and other venues as Novak Djokovic in Australia. All part of President Macron's stated intent to harry and to annoy the unvaccinated in his attempt to squeeze that last extra percent or two to give up and get the jab. More than 91% of French adults, remember it was originally the most vaccine-hesitant country in Western Europe, more than 91% have been fully vaccinated. Also, the German Health Minister, Karl Lauterbach, has called for the EU to reduce the period that people recovered from COVID while unvaccinated can travel freely within the EU. He wants it reduced from 6 months to 3 months. Now, at this stage, Omicron is widespread across Europe, so it's unclear what the scientific basis for any such restrictions would be now. But a lot of those measures seem to be as much about punishing the unvaccinated than they are about protecting people. At least there's some good news if you're unvaccinated and in Austria, which you probably need because you've been actually locked down for the last few weeks. Austria, you'll recall, responded to Omicron by formally splitting its society, locking down the unvaccinated. Well, that lockdown has now come to an end, although that won't end all restrictions on them. Other countries are going further in an echo of England's actions. So Denmark is scrapping all COVID measures. COVID passports are out, nightclubs can reopen, no obligations remaining to wear face masks. And the Netherlands, the only European country to go into full general lockdown over Omicron, will relax many of its restrictions as well. Restaurants, bars and cultural venues will now be allowed to open until 10 p.m. because new research has shown that Omicron now only comes out at night, or something. By the way, I mentioned Novak Djokovic, the world's most famous non-vaccinated person, who might be in serious trouble after the BBC calculated that his positive COVID test used to try to gain entry to the Australian Open a couple of weeks ago did not fit within the timescale he claimed for it, based on its serial number. By comparing the number ranges with tests obtained from its own staff in Serbia, along with a number of other people, it was able to show that it didn't match Djokovic's claims. Now that could turn out to be a real problem for him. I'm guessing that if it turned out to be evidence of deliberate misstatements of COVID test results, that could be a legal issue, for all that he's Serbia's favourite athlete, and it could equally be grounds for disciplinary measures within the sport. If nothing else, it could certainly prompt Australia not to waive the 3-year ban currently implied by how he was deported a couple of weeks ago. Now, in a minute, we'll look at some of the rest of the news and the short thought for the week. But first, Wednesday next week will be the first of a month. I know! Already a month into 2022. This stuff is just flying past. Anyway, that means it's time for the monthly live stream. I will be talking about the topical events of the moment, taking your questions and comments from the live chat. That will be taking place 7 p.m. UK time next Wednesday, the 2nd of February. Join me for that. In a sign of the post-Brexit new regime, such as it is, research into the genetic editing of plants in the UK is about to become easier, with new rules being brought in that will encourage field trials and research. Breaking away from the EU's strongly negative approach to any development on genetic editing or modification is seen as an opportunity to develop new crop varieties that need less pesticides, have less environmental impact, are resilient to expected climate change and provide better nutrition. The focus is on editing using CRISPR, a technique that's able to more precisely modify crop genes, but without the introduction of outside genetic material of other plants or animals, as in standard genetic modification. It's less controversial than standard GM foods, but the European Court disappointed many scientists and agriculturalists in 2019 when it decided to treat CRISPR techniques as no different to other genetic modification. Now, another EU agriculture policy has also come under attack for unintended consequences this week, as it was reported that biofuel targets have created serious pest problems and led to the import of record levels of palm oil, disliked by many environmentalists for its link to tropical deforestation. According to a study by Rothamsted Research, the push by the EU since 2003 to grow oilseed rape to produce oil for biofuels led to a massive expansion in the crop, unsurprisingly. For thousands of fields growing the same crop led to the rise of the cabbage stem flea beetle and the pollen beetle, which forced farmers to increase their use of pesticides, including neonicotinoids. Now, neonicotinoids were banned in 2013, and this began a chain of consequences that left the crop susceptible to beetle damage. In 2020, it was estimated that 4 out of every 10 UK fields didn't produce a harvest as a result. Dr. Patricia Ortega Ramos, lead author of the study, said this: "The EU's 2009 Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive was not well implemented, and as a result of that and subsequent decisions, the cabbage stem flea beetle has now become a serious pest. The area of oilseed rape being grown is now falling sharply, with huge financial consequences for farmers and major environmental consequences for all of us. Meanwhile, in the US, the retirement of the Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer has led once again to the expectation of a new appointment that will be largely influenced by the colour of someone's skin, not the quality of their character. President Biden had flagged long ago that his criteria for selection for a new Supreme Court judge would be that it should be a black woman. All of this is reported by the mainstream media as though it's not a remarkable thing to do, to actively promise to discriminate based on race and sex for a high public position. This was said to ensure that there's representation of this group on the court, but the Supreme Court is a legal body, not a representative group. Now, okay, in the US it is, unfortunately, a deeply political body, not just based on interpreting the law. That is a problem, but then people say so is presuming that someone's skin colour makes them representative for all others of that skin colour. It's not entirely as straightforward as a left-right divide, mind, whatever some people would have you believe, because Ronald Reagan, after all, did something kind of similar when he stated his intention to nominate the first woman candidate, which he fulfilled with Sandra Day O'Connor. Ultimately, if the person that Biden picks has the credentials and the qualities you would associate with the position, no doubt it will end up mattering not very much. But after all, some people suggest that principle didn't stand up quite so well when it came to appointing Kamala Harris as vice president. Those critics argue that it's another step on the re-legitimising of racial discrimination. It could be a temporary aberration in the name of correcting a historical imbalance, but it could also be the next step into the slippery slope of identity politics. What it won't be is a major difference to the court, the replacement of a Liberal judge with another Liberal judge. Given Conservatives have a 6-3 majority, it doesn't fit their interest to be seen to be obstructing this appointment unless the pick turns out to be blatantly unsuitable, and surely that would never happen. The comedian Louis C.K. said that everyone sitting on a flight should be spending the whole time saying, "Oh my God, we're flying! It's amazing! You're sitting in a chair in the sky," he said. But you're probably whining about the Wi-Fi not working. I thought about that when I watched a video recently about the famous Doomsday clock, the clock that supposedly indicates how close we are to hurling ourselves over the precipice. A panel of distinguished people at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have decided that we're very close indeed, 100 seconds to midnight. And when it had its recent update, the event was marked by various people talking about how bad things are, how they're worse now than they've ever been in the last 75 years or whatever it was. Now maybe they're right, but it's hard to tell because we have a pervasive negative mindset and it distorts how we see the world. It's easy to think about all the things we might worry about, string them all together, and then conclude that it means that we stand on the edge of the cataclysm. When I did the research on the Earth's climate history and how it impacted on life, I was struck by how amazing and miraculous the planet is and life is, and we've come to a point where we can begin to figure out how amazing it all is. We care about stuff. We should care about stuff because we're protecting something wonderful and precious. But also we can often acknowledge that, but sincerely believe that everything would be great if only humans weren't so stupid and bad and wicked. You can find plenty of anecdotes and examples to point to, sure, but overall we're often bad at things because they're hard and we've never done them before. So social media is a mess. Yeah. But then, it's the most significant communications revolution in history of the human race and the history of the planet. It shouldn't be a huge surprise that it's kind of hard and we haven't yet worked out how to do it properly. Human beings have gotten to where we are because we are persistently curious, always trying to do things that haven't been done before. We are the people, yes, who sit on the plane and complain, but we're also the people who invented the damn plane and made it possible to travel the world. I don't believe we'll solve all those doomsday problems by deciding we have to be something other than what we are. by deciding that we have to retreat and withdraw. Rather, we'll do it by being curious as to what is the truth, optimistic about our ability to respond and solve problems, and realistic about the fact that it's going to be hard along the way. Hard problems are made up of smaller, easier problems, and the key is to focus in and get started on what can be done right now. Don't expect it to be easy. Prepare for it to be hard, because that's also what makes it worth doing. Now, one of the miracles I remain thankful for, of course, is the people who support this channel on Patreon. Without them, I could not commit the time to producing 3 videos per week, at least one of which includes a significant amount of time going into research. And I would not be able to deal with the sometimes controversial topics that I do, the important topics where there are often heightened sensitivities and issues around censorship. It's been quite a while since I've had a video demonetized, but I did have one last week because it was re-rated as not suitable for children, and that puts it in the demonetized pool. And that's going to happen from time to time because I do not avoid the difficult issues. I'm not prepared to avoid questions of the orthodoxy and the mainstream narrative, which is the point. A lot of people avoid mentioning certain topics, won't even use the word, for example, ivermectin, because they just don't know whether it's going to get them banned. It becomes a chilling effect. You have to ignore those risks if you're not going to end up a victim of self-censorship. So much easier to do, knowing that you're not dependent on YouTube advertising for income. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.